Hi, why would a nation that covered lands all the way from the south of Scotland to the south of France and the Pyrenees be concerned with a tiny principality that did not even cover all of Wales? Well, why did Hitler bother with Czechoslovakia, another tiny mountainous country? Because we lived next door to a psychopathic dictator who rose to power in the 1270s, and we suffered a similar fate. This is Benjamin, and that's what we come to in this episode. By 1267 and the Treaty of Trefaldwyn or Montgomery, we had established in Wales a principality under Llywelyn ap Gruffudd's leadership. After 8 military victories over his career, at least he had forced Henry III in a weakened position to recognise him as the Prince of Wales and to recognise in English law the Principality of Wales and its right to exist apart from English law within English law. And this was what nations like Serbia had done around the same time, and Wallachia, which would eventually become Romania. And it looked for a brief moment as though we had done this. Succeeded to build a feudal political state under our own monarch. King Edward came to the throne in 1272. And from this point things really do shift in our position here in Wales, because this man's ambitious is harsh. He comes down harshly upon Gascony in France, in Ireland. He's declared the Lord of Ireland. And then he expresses his imperial ambitions over Wales and Scotland. There's a clear difference between him and the other English kings before him. He is noticeably less French in attitude, much more English and boisterous and rude. And this is very bad for us. This man had daddy issues, big time. This man expelled the Jews later on. I mean, he was a psychopath. Crucially, Edward and Llywelyn could not be more different in terms of character and temperance. The woman that Llywelyn loved, King Edward took and seized her when she was on a ship between England and France, and held her as ransom in order for him to pay homage and tribute. And it's crucial, again, that we look at Llywelyn the Last, not so much as the last, but Llywelyn ap Gruffudd. We have more documentation of who this man is, his character, than any other king or prince in Welsh history, because he's so modern and closer to us compared to so many. But because the poets wrote about him, because King Edward wrote about him, and King Edward and Llywelyn exchanged letters, and the reasons that Llywelyn gives are passionate. Defending family, defending nation, defending the right to inheritance. This was a defiant man, a loving man, a caring man. He's not just the last. The 1270s. The 1270s in Gwynedd mark a significant change. They are clearly saying, we are one nation and England is another, in a new, very modernized way. Gwynedd of the 1270s, its poetry changes. Poets like Llygad Gwr are calling Llywelyn King of the Welsh, whose quarrel was with an alien nation. Welsh poets are saying words like Cymru Fawr, Greater Wales, to say that we own lands, everything to the west of the River Severn is rightfully ours, according to the claims of the Kingdom of Powys, which is now ruled, in their eyes, by Gwynedd. They are calling us a polity, and they're using words that echo France and Portugal. David, he felt that he had been slighted, of course, because Llywelyn took the crown for himself of Gwynedd. His own brother joined in a plot against him with a long hostile lord in southern Powys, and when it failed, he fled to England, and King Edward, who had come to power, saw this as an excuse to invade, to win over a clear heir in David, using this as a pretense to get back what he considered his lands in Prydferthwlad. Llywelyn, having spent over 20 years gathering together his principality and stabilizing Wales through his rule, now faced lords across his domain, seeing an opportunity to rise up, and they began to flip sides to King Edward to see if they could get an opportunity to replace him, and their fighters joined them. And so Llywelyn was in an impossible situation. He was having to fight England and his own lords, and he had no choice but to come to terms. But I should stress here, the next war would be very different, because these lords were going to live under English force for years. And so in the next war, in 1282 and going into 1283, this war erupting in 1282 was very different from the war in 1277, because these lords who had lived under a more direct rule from England resented it and saw they had made a clear mistake in 1277, and they rallied back around Llywelyn, and this became a national war of independence. But did not get rid of Llywelyn. That would have been too risky at this point and very expensive. The War of 1276-1277 was conventional in that King Edward sent a fleet around and invaded along the north coast, as is the traditional English invasion routes. And it was hard and bitter, and forced Llywelyn to concede vast swathes of territory east of Avon Conwy. But also, it was remarkable in that his brother, Llywelyn and David, Llywelyn forgave his brother. He didn't see him forever as a traitor. He invited him back into its midst, gave him right to his own lands in Gwynedd. The Principality in 1277 was broken. It lasted only 10 years. But it was not the end of Llywelyn. He carried on with his brother David. In the meantime, King Edward was busy reading about Welsh law, trying to understand our mythology, the words of Geoffrey of Monmouth and the history of the kings of Britain and these prophecies of Welsh conquest, reconquest of England. He's going through our manuscripts, finding justification for wiping us from the face of the earth for several years. And there's an Archbishop, Peckham, who is openly preaching that we Welsh are barbarous, our laws are uncivilized, we need to be absorbed out of existence and into England. I cannot understress how much the church was involved in this war on the side of England, and there's talk of conspiracies in Bangor, and there's clear preachings beating the drum of anti-Welshness in England to drum up support for Edward, and he's using that as propaganda in the church against us. Now keep in mind, in this war of 1277, there was no clear intention King Edward wanted to wipe out Gwynedd at that point, it would have been quite expensive, and he obviously needed time to prepare. But there's no clear precedent for it either. And in 1280, a commission is set up to review Welsh law. With that law commission in mind, and the Archbishop Peckham and Edward I turning to see our law as a barbarity to be expunged, Llywelyn stood irreversibly firm that we Welsh have the right to our own law, and he was willing to die for that belief. Even nearly 750 years on, some of his letters make very moving reading. I would make the letters exchanged by Llywelyn with England at this time necessary reading for every child in Wales. We need to understand that there was correspondence between us and England, and that it was England who was being unreasonable. We did not invoke this war. It was forced upon us, and the lands in which David ignited a rebellion in shortly, in 1282, there were injustices going on. Welsh people were denied their rights, their laws, their lands in their own nation. King Edward was constantly trying to reduce the Principality. Edward even tried to buy Llywelyn out of his country with estates in England. In the end, Llywelyn was forced to act by his brother David, who rebelled in the new occupied lands on the east. David attacked Castell Penarlog on Easter, which was quite significant because they felt that David later would need a special punishment for this transgression. People were calling on some type of deliverance from this oppression. And when King Edward I, let's call him Edward the Psychopath to do it justice, when King Edward the Psychopath wrote to Llywelyn telling him to put down his brother David's rebellion, the brother who had tried to assassinate and kill him after all, Llywelyn wrote back and said he will not betray his ancestors all the way back to the mythological days of King Arthur and Brutus and all that. He joined his brother's rebellion and retook lands to the east, and then concentrated an army in Gwynedd and waited for King Edward to come after them. Must have been a very hard choice. But he had a young, recently born daughter. He had no clear heir. He had no ability to parcel out lands according to Welsh custom unless he conquered more land. So he had nothing to lose. The King of England had taken everything possible that he could from Llywelyn without directly conquering him, and this could easily have been King Edward's, the psychopath's, intention all along, to force Llywelyn to fight. Now, about this war that broke out in 1283, which was basically something we were forced into, we almost won this war. This was not just they marched over us. This was a very, very different war from 1277, having experienced the oppressive nature of King Edward the Psychopath and the imposition of laws and those structures upon our nation for just a few 5-6 years. The Welsh lords across Wales rallied to Llywelyn's cause. David and Llywelyn were very united. David led troops south with other Welsh lords. The English launched a three-pronged attack, one up from the south, one from the middle lands around Aberrondy and Powys into the Principality, and the main big one, King Edward himself, along the north coast, the traditional route. Now this southern prong of attack met with Welsh forces at Llandela, and we defeated them. We won a victory. We cut them down. So he was replaced, this Earl of Gloucester. Edward replaced him with the Earl of Pembroke, who raided as far as Aberystwyth, but failed to engage with a Welsh army. he couldn't carry on his supply lines. We kept hitting and hit and run attacks. The second prong, led by Roger Mortimer, suffered a setback when this commander Roger died. And in the north, making some initial headway, they tried to attack on his mom to carry out a surprise attack. His men built a pontoon bridge, and as soon as they crossed back to the mainland, they were ambushed and suffered heavy losses at Battle Moyle Dawn. So the English had suffered 3 steep losses. The Archbishop in Canterbury began conducting peace negotiations. We were on the verge of winning this war. And unexpectedly, Llywelyn marched out of Gwynedd, and possibly because the war was going such in his favour. You need more people. We're not a very numerous nation, population-wise, and we had allies towards Llanfair Fiallt. And that's where he went. And unexpectedly he was ambushed and killed, and his band wiped out at the Battle of Pont Orewyn. And Edward's seen this as quite fortuitous to his nearly disastrous campaign, marched straight into Gwyned's heartland and took it out. David was captured and executed quite brutally at Arymwythig, Shrewsbury. King Edward the psychopath went to great lengths to demolish buildings, Welsh institutions, to get rid of royal items, jewels, any people connected by lineage. He had them removed, all that he could find connected to the royal house of Aberfraw, destroyed, and courts, anything that he could to erase the memory of our existence was burned, demolished, or turned into a symbol of England to use against us. An age of Welsh kingdoms and princes, extending all the way back to Rome, was gone. This 900-year period of our history was over. And what was to come next? The age of our people has ended. Gwynedd Llywelyn Coch wrote a eulogy for Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. It's an apocalyptic poem. Pon I welwch chi hynt y gwynt ar y glaw, pon I welwch chi'r derri yn ymdaraw, pon I welwch chi'r môr yn merwyn nawr y tir, pon I chi welwch y gwir yn ymgywiraw, pon I welwch chi'r hael yn chwilaw'r awyr, pon I welwch chi'r sir wedi'r syrthiaw. It's a catastrophe for Wales. But that was 740 years ago, and we are still here. So what came next? How did this conquest change us? That's what we come to next time. Thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr iawn, for making it to the end of this video. If you liked it and you like this content, please consider Patreon to spur this channel forward. And for those of you just who watch, like, become a channel member, give a super like, anything, that helps keep this channel going. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.